In the shadow of Caesar's murder, Rome bled from within. Senators turned assassins, comrades became enemies, and the very republic that had conquered the world now devoured itself. At Philippi in the marshes of Macedonia, destiny gathered two legions of fate. Brutus and Cassius, champions of the old republic, stood against Octavian and Antony, heirs of vengeance. This was no ordinary battle. It was a reckoning that would decide not just who ruled Rome, but whether Rome itself would survive. Stay with us as we march through betrayal, ambition, and the clash that sealed Rome's fate at Philippi. If history's turning points ignite your curiosity, don't just watch. Join the story, like, share, and tell us, whose Rome would you have fought for? The Ides of March, 44 BC. Rome's beating heart was struck with a dagger. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, master of civil war, and self-proclaimed dictator for life, lay sprawled at the base of Pompey's statue, bleeding beneath the blades of his peers. The men who had once called him friend and mentor now plunged steel into his body, believing that by killing him they could preserve the fading spirit of the Republic. Yet in that single act of blood, they unleashed a tempest that would tear Rome apart. Rome was no stranger to violence. Civil war had scarred her before. Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Caesar, each had turned the Republic's armies against themselves. But this was different. This was not merely a struggle of generals. This was a war for Rome's very soul. When Caesar's blood stained the Senate floor, the conspirators, Brutus, Cassius, and their noble allies, imagined they had struck a blow for liberty. "Thus always to tyrants," they whispered in triumph, but their daggers could not cut away Caesar's shadow. In death, his presence loomed larger than life. The city trembled. Crowds poured into the streets, uncertain whether to rejoice or mourn. Some hailed the liberators as saviors who had rescued the Republic from monarchy's chains. Others cursed them as traitors who had butchered Rome's champion. The Forum, once the heart of political debate, became an echo chamber of fury, fear, and grief. For every Roman who longed for the Republic's return, another demanded vengeance for Caesar's blood. At the funeral pyre, the tide turned. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, lifted the blood-soaked toga before the masses and spoke words that carved themselves into Rome's memory. He showed them the wounds, counted the stabs, and named the men who had inflicted them. Fury erupted. The people howled for justice. The conspirators who had dreamt of restoring order found themselves hunted by the very citizens they claimed to protect. Flames rose as Caesar's body was burned, and with it burned the last illusion that Rome could return to what it once was. Chaos descended. The Republic, already frayed by decades of civil strife, began to unravel. Senators fled. Provinces seethed with uncertainty, and armies shifted allegiance like gamblers, hedging their bets. Without Caesar, Rome was a ship without a captain, tossed upon waves of ambition and revenge. Power did not vanish with his death. It merely scattered, waiting for new hands to seize it. In the vacuum rose two figures, Marcus Antonius, Antony, the seasoned warrior who had fought beside Caesar in Gaul and Egypt, and Gaius Octavius, Octavian, Caesar's young adopted heir, scarcely 20 years old, yet burning with destiny. Neither could claim Rome alone. Neither could let the other rule unchecked. Yet for a time, necessity bound them together. For before they could contest each other, they had to avenge the man whose ghost haunted the Republic. But before Antony and Octavian forged their uneasy alliance, the killers of Caesar sought to justify their deed. Brutus, descendant of the man who had expelled Rome's last king, painted himself as the savior of liberty. Cassius, shrewd and fiery, railed against tyranny. They marched east, gathering legions from the provinces, hoping distance from the fury of Rome would give them strength. Yet even as they rallied soldiers under the banner of the Republic, Rome herself was splitting apart. The Senate no longer spoke with one voice. The Republic was a carcass, and its vultures circled eagerly. Rome had endured wars with Carthage, struggles with barbarian tribes, and endless foreign campaigns. But never before had her greatest danger come from within. Brother turned against brother. Comrades who had once fought side by side in Caesar's campaigns now sharpened their swords against one another. The legions of Rome, once the terror of the world, now prepared to slaughter themselves in the name of opposing visions of Rome's future. And so the stage was set. From Caesar's corpse arose not peace, not liberty, but a reckoning that would consume the Republic. His assassins believed they had slain a tyrant. Instead, they had birthed an empire. The tragedy of Rome was not Caesar's death alone, but the slow, bloody realization that with his fall, the Republic itself was mortally wounded. In the silence after his funeral, as ashes cooled and daggers dripped with memory, one truth became clear. Rome's greatest war would not be against Parthia, Gaul, or Carthage, but against herself. From the ashes of Caesar's funeral pyre, two figures stepped forth to claim destiny. They were unlikely allies, one forged in battle and fire, the other scarcely more than a youth. But together they would become the twin heirs of vengeance, bound by loyalty to Caesar and ambition for Rome. Their names were Mark Antony and Gaius Octavian. Antony was Caesar's right hand, a soldier's soldier, towering in stature, with a voice that could rouse legions and a temper as fierce as Mars. He had marched through mud, blood, and victory at Caesar's side. To the veterans of Gaul and Egypt, Antony was more than a commander. He was a brother in arms, a man who drank with them, fought beside them, and shared their spoils. His loyalty to Caesar was not born of politics, but of devotion. Where Caesar had led, Antony had followed, and now that Caesar was gone, Antony would see the daggers avenged. Yet Antony was not merely a soldier. He was cunning, theatrical, and ruthless in his pursuit of power. His funeral oration had lit Rome aflame, turning the people against the conspirators. With one speech, he had transformed assassins into traitors, and Caesar's death into a cause for war. He wielded words as deftly as the sword, knowing when to inflame, when to charm, and when to threaten. To many Romans, Antony was the living flame of Caesar's legacy, a man too fierce to let the Republic's enemies rest. Octavian, by contrast, was Caesar's heir in name and blood, though not yet in stature. Adopted in Caesar's will, this youth of 19 inherited not only the dictator's fortune, but his sacred name, Caesar. At first, few took him seriously. He was frail in health, inexperienced in command, and unknown to the legions. Senators scoffed, and even Antony dismissed him as a boy, unfit to rule Rome's destiny. But Octavian possessed something rarer than brute strength. He had patience, calculation, and an iron will hidden beneath a modest exterior. From the moment he learned of his adoption, Octavian embraced it with unshakable resolve. He journeyed to Rome, refusing to be overshadowed by Antony or cowed by the Senate. Where Antony roared, Octavian whispered. Where Antony moved with fury, Octavian moved with cold precision. Slowly, silently, he won allies. He courted the veterans with promises of land, appealed to Caesar's supporters with the sanctity of the family name, and presented himself as the true son of the fallen leader. In a city ablaze with faction and fury, Octavian played the part of dutiful heir, but within his heart burned a vision greater than any realized by Caesar himself. The two men could not have been more different. Antony, reckless, passionate, beloved by the legions but distrusted by the Senate. Octavian, disciplined, calculating, underestimated by all but destined to outlast them. Their partnership was born not of friendship, but of necessity. Caesar's assassins, Brutus, Cassius, and the other conspirators, still commanded legions and provinces in the east. Until they were crushed, neither Antony nor Octavian could claim Rome securely. Revenge bound them together, even as ambition kept them wary. Together they forged a fragile alliance. Antony commanded the loyalty of seasoned soldiers, Octavian the legitimacy of Caesar's name. The Senate, desperate to play one against the other, found itself overpowered by their combined weight. With the addition of Marcus Lepidus, Caesar's master of cavalry, they formed what history would call the Second Triumvirate. This was not a republic, nor even a pretense of one. It was raw power, carved into three parts, each man holding life and death over Rome's citizens. They sealed their pact not with words alone, but with blood, launching prescriptions that hunted down enemies, confiscated wealth, and silenced dissent. Cicero, Rome's great orator and defender of the Republic, fell beneath their decree, his head displayed in the Forum as a grim warning. The days of free speech and senatorial rule were over. In the eyes of Rome, Antony and Octavian became avenging deities. They promised not merely to punish Caesar's killers, but to restore order to a republic choking on chaos. Each man claimed to fight for Rome's salvation, yet beneath the banners of justice lay ambition far greater. Antony saw himself as Caesar's true successor, the man of the legions, heir to martial glory. Octavian, cold and silent, nurtured a vision beyond Antony's reckoning. A Rome not torn by civil war, but unified under one rule, his own. Still, before their rivalry could ignite, their vengeance demanded satisfaction. Brutus and Cassius, masters of the East, had not been idle. They had gathered wealth, allies, and armies in Macedonia, in Asia Minor, proclaiming themselves defenders of liberty. If Antony and Octavian wished to seize Rome, they would first have to march against the very men who had slain their benefactor. Thus the alliance of fire and ice, passion and calculation began its march eastward. As their armies swelled, so too did their legend. To the veterans, Antony was the general they trusted, the man who had bled beside Caesar. To the younger recruits, Octavian was the divine heir, the boy who bore Caesar's name like a shield against fortune. Between them, they commanded not just soldiers, but symbols, symbols more potent than swords. One embodied Caesar's flesh and memory, the other his spirit and promise. Together they became a living myth, the avengers of Rome. But within the myth lay seeds of rivalry. The legions saw Antony's vigor and Octavian's caution, and whispers grew of which man would outlast the other. The Senate, still scheming for survival, plotted to exploit their differences. Yet for now, these differences were buried beneath the greater cause. Rome demanded vengeance, and vengeance required unity. Antony's fire and Octavian's frost fused into an iron will to march to Philippi, to face Brutus and Cassius, and to decide once and for all who would hold Caesar's Rome. Thus rose the heroes of this tragedy, not flawless men, but men whose flaws made them dangerous. Antony, driven by honor and appetite, and Octavian, masked by humility but sharpened by ambition. Their names would echo across centuries, not merely as generals, but as architects of an empire yet unborn. For in their rise, Rome saw both her salvation and her doom. The Republic's fate no longer rested in the Senate's decrees, but in the hands of two men who carried Caesar's ghost within them. And as their armies marched eastward, the world held its breath, knowing that in their victory or defeat lay the death of the Republic and the birth of an empire. Rome was not merely a city, it was the beating heart of a vast dominion that stretched from the sands of Africa to the forests of Gaul, from the shores of Hispania to the mountains of Asia Minor. For centuries, its Senate had boasted of ruling with wisdom, of binding provinces together under the banner of the Republic. But after Caesar's assassination, that heart no longer beat in unison. It spasmed, faltered, and bled into factions. What had been one republic was now many Romes, each clinging to its own vision of the future. The Senate itself, once the proud guardian of the Republic, was torn apart. Some hailed Brutus and Cassius as liberators, defenders of liberty against a would-be tyrant. To them, the daggers that pierced Caesar's body had struck in defense of ancestral tradition. Yet others, cowed by Antony's fury and Octavian's claim to Caesar's name, bent knee to the avengers. What had once been the Senate's chamber of debate became a theater of fear, where words were weighed not by reason, but by survival. Speak for the wrong man, and your name might appear on the next prescription list. Speak too boldly, and your head might join Cicero's in the Forum. Beyond Rome, the provinces festered with uncertainty. Governors and generals, men who commanded legions in far-off lands, were forced to choose sides. In Macedonia in the east, Brutus and Cassius held sway, rallying soldiers with the cry of liberty. In Italy in the west, Antony and Octavian drew strength from Caesar's veterans, promising them land, wealth, and vengeance. What had once been a single republic became a chessboard of shifting loyalties. each province a piece in a deadly game of survival. For the people of Rome, the tragedy was unbearable. Bread grew scarce, debts mounted, and the specter of war hovered above every street. Citizens who once cheered Caesar's triumphs now whispered of civil slaughter. Families were torn apart as brothers joined different legions, sons marched under opposing banners, and fathers cursed the names of their own kin. To fight for Antony was to embrace Caesar's legacy. To fight for Brutus was to defend the Republic. But to fight at all was to spill Roman blood on Roman soil. The glory of Rome, once feared by kings and empires, was now turned inward, devouring itself. The triumvirs, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, deepened the wound. In their ruthless bid to secure Rome, they unleashed the proscriptions, lists of enemies condemned to death and dispossession. Wealthy equestrians, senators, and citizens found their names carved onto tablets of doom. Assassins hunted them in alleys, soldiers seized their estates, and families were left destitute. To live in Rome during those years was to breathe the air of terror, never knowing if tomorrow would bring a knock on the door and a sword at your throat. The Republic's noble ideals, liberty, justice, debate, drowned beneath waves of blood and greed. And yet, even as Rome tore itself apart, the conspirators in the East painted themselves as saviors. Brutus, calm and dignified, invoked his ancestor who had expelled Rome's kings centuries before. Cassius, fiery and sharp, railed against the tyranny of Caesar's heirs. To their legions, they promised not wealth or land, but freedom, the preservation of the Republic itself. Many believed them, for though Antony and Octavian claimed to fight for Caesar, what they truly fought for was dominion. To march with Brutus was to march for principle. To march with Antony and Octavian was to march for vengeance. But principles alone could not bind Rome together. Each side claimed to hold the Republic's soul, yet in truth the Republic itself was already a ghost. The Senate was powerless, the people cowed, the provinces divided, and the legions, the very core of Rome's might, were no longer Rome's but their commanders. The state no longer owned its armies. The armies owned the state, and whichever commander triumphed would not merely win power, he would inherit Rome entire. As the legions gathered for the coming storm, the air itself seemed to thrum with destiny. Messengers galloped across provinces, spreading news of alliances and betrayals. Ships ferried soldiers across the Adriatic, filling harbors with the clang of armor and the prayers of men who knew they would soon face their brothers in battle. In taverns and markets, citizens argued bitterly over which cause was just, even as fear gnawed at their hearts. Rome was no longer united by conquest. She was fractured by memory, vengeance, and ambition. The old republic, born in the age of king's expulsion, could not withstand the weight of its own greatness. It had conquered too much, grown too vast, and empowered too many ambitious men. In Caesar's death, the republic's contradictions burst open like wounds too long ignored. Liberty and tyranny, senate and general, people and soldier, all clashed in a cacophony that no law could silence. The world's mightiest republic was shaking itself to pieces. Thus the stage was set for the final reckoning. Rome's provinces chose their champions, her legions prepared to slaughter one another, and her senate cowered in fear of whichever victor might emerge. No foreign army threatened her walls. No barbarian tribe stormed her gates. Rome's greatest enemy was Rome herself, and until the fields of Philippi drank the blood of her sons, the Republic would know no peace. If Antony and Octavian were the avengers of Caesar, then Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus were the champions of the Republic. To their enemies, they were traitors, assassins who had stained the Senate floor with blood. To their allies, they were liberators, men who had dared to raise daggers against a tyrant. In them, Rome's last breath of liberty clung desperately, even as the tide of history swelled against them. Brutus was no common conspirator. Descended from Lucius Junius Brutus, the legendary founder who had expelled Rome's last king, his name carried with it the weight of centuries. Quiet, austere, and philosophical, Brutus was the very image of Roman virtue. He was no schemer thirsting for power, no warlord craving dominion. To his followers, he embodied the noble dream that the Republic could yet be saved. When his dagger pierced Caesar's flesh, he believed he struck not from hatred, but from duty. Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more, he would say. His was a tragic purity, a belief that ideals could triumph over ambition, that principle could outweigh power. Yet history rarely favors the pure. Cassius, by contrast, was fire where Brutus was stone. A seasoned general and sharp-tongued politician, he possessed the cunning of a fox and the rage of a storm. He had long despised Caesar, seeing in him the makings of a monarch who would grind the Senate beneath his heel. Where Brutus hesitated, Cassius struck. Where Brutus spoke of philosophy, Cassius spoke of survival. If Brutus was the soul of the conspiracy, Cassius was its heartbeat. Together they formed a partnership of principle and pragmatism, one drawing men through virtue, the other through strategy. After Caesar's assassination, both men knew Rome itself was unsafe. The people, swayed by Antony's fiery words, had turned against them. The Senate, trembling under the shadow of vengeance, could no longer offer protection. So Brutus and Cassius fled eastward, to the provinces of Macedonia and Asia, where their influence was strongest. There they gathered legions, gold, and allies, weaving together a resistance not of rebels, but of Romans who still believed in the Republic's cause. Their armies grew vast, nearly as many as those commanded by Antony and Octavian. From the wealthy cities of Asia Minor, they drew immense treasure to pay their soldiers. From the provinces weary of Caesar's dominance, they found sympathy and recruits. Unlike Antony and Octavian, who demanded loyalty through fear and prescription, Brutus and Cassius spoke of liberty, tradition, and the salvation of Rome's ancient laws. Many who despised tyranny rallied to their banners, believing that the Republic's spirit marched within their ranks. Yet even as they prepared for war, the differences between them showed. Brutus was cautious, reluctant to wage civil bloodshed, and often sought compromise. Cassius was urgent, driven, determined to strike before their enemies could gather full strength. This tension between philosophy and pragmatism would haunt their leadership, for Rome's destiny demanded unity of purpose, and unity was the very thing the Republic could no longer muster. To Antony and Octavian, they were villains, betrayers of Caesar, destroyers of order. Antony mocked their appeals to liberty, painting them as hypocrites who cloaked ambition beneath philosophy. Octavian, wielding Caesar's name like a sword, cast them as murderers whose crime demanded eternal vengeance. To the Roman people, who loved spectacle more than subtlety, the image of Brutus and Cassius as tyrannicides faded beneath the blaze of Antony's rhetoric and Octavian's divine inheritance. But to their soldiers, they were commanders of honor. Brutus inspired loyalty through his calm dignity, Cassius through his fierce resolve. Together they forged armies not of mercenaries, but of men who believed they fought for Rome's soul. The stage of their defiance was Macedonia, a land of plains and marshes, where Alexander the Great had once forged his empire. There, Brutus and Cassius prepared to face the might of Caesar's avengers. They knew the odds were perilous. The triumvirs commanded the heart of Rome, the veterans of Caesar in the wealth of the West. Yet Brutus and Cassius commanded conviction, and conviction can sometimes weigh more heavily than gold. In the months before Philippi, Brutus displayed his nobility most clearly. He refused to execute prisoners of war, treated allies with respect, and carried himself as though the Republic had never fallen. He spoke of philosophy by campfires, reminding his soldiers that they fought not merely for him, but for Rome's ancient liberty. He was, in every sense, the last Roman idealist. Cassius, meanwhile, oversaw the hard labor of supply, discipline, and strategy. He calculated the movements of the enemy, ensured the loyalty of commanders, and prepared for the clash he knew was inevitable. One embodied Rome's heart, the other her mind. But noble ideals and sharp minds could not erase the storm that brewed. The triumvirs, with their prescriptions and promises, had secured dominance in the West. Their legions marched eastward, hungry for revenge. The Republic's defenders knew they stood at a precipice. Victory could restore the Senate's dignity and humble the tyrants in waiting. Defeat would not merely end their lives, it would extinguish the Republic forever. And yet in this looming tragedy there was grandeur. Brutus and Cassius were no cowards fleeing destiny. They embraced it with open eyes, knowing that Rome's fate would be written in the marshes of Philippi. They were men of contradiction, honorable yet ruthless, principled yet pragmatic, defenders of liberty who raised armies like kings. History would not absolve them, but neither could it deny their courage. They stood as Rome's final guardians, even as Rome herself prepared to betray them. Thus the adversaries of Rome emerged not as villains, but as tragic heroes of a fading age. They were the last champions of the Republic, men who believed that a world ruled by senate and citizen could survive in the shadow of empire. Their names would forever be stained with Caesar's blood, yet also sanctified by the dream of freedom. In their rise, Rome glimpsed not treachery alone, but the desperate hope that liberty might yet endure. And in their fall, the Republic would draw its final breath. The Republic trembled on the edge of ruin, yet in its darkest hour, two figures rose as architects of Rome's rebirth. They were not saviors in the ancient sense, cloaked in virtue or crowned with divine favor. They were flawed, ruthless, and bound by ambition. But in Antony and Octavian, the fractured Republic found new masters, men who could impose order upon chaos. Their alliance was uneasy, their visions opposed, yet together they became the hammer and anvil upon which the fate of Rome would be forged. Antony, seasoned by years under Caesar's command, embodied the martial genius of Rome. He understood legions as few others did, how to inspire their loyalty, how to unleash their fury, and how to steady their resolve when fear gnawed at their ranks. On the march he was tireless, in battle, relentless. Where others quailed at the prospect of civil slaughter, Antony thrived. War was his element, the battlefield his stage. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had walked through the storms of Gaul, who had stared down the kings of Egypt, and who had stood at Caesar's side in victory. To the veterans, Antony was not merely a commander. He was Caesar's living flame. Yet Antony's brilliance was not only in steel and blood. He possessed an instinct for theater, for the spectacle that could transform politics into power. At Caesar's funeral, he had inflamed the mob with words, wielding the dictator's torn toga as if it were a banner of vengeance. Now, as the triumvirs prepared for war, Antony did the same with his soldiers. He promised them vengeance, yes, but also land, wealth, and glory. He painted the conspirators not as noble men defending liberty, but as craven traitors who had murdered Rome's greatest son. His legions did not merely fight, they burned with conviction. They marched not just for Rome, but for Caesar, and through Caesar, for Antony himself. Octavian, by contrast, embodied discipline, calculation, and vision. At barely 20 years of age, he was still a youth in body, but already ancient in spirit. Where Antony raged, Octavian plotted. Where Antony demanded, Octavian negotiated. He was not beloved as Antony was, nor did he inspire the same raw passion. Instead, he cultivated loyalty through steadiness, through the promise of stability in a world torn apart. His soldiers did not see him as a comrade in arms, but as a figure touched by destiny, for he carried Caesar's name, and with it, the sacred mantle of legitimacy. To disobey Octavian was to disobey Caesar's heir. To fight beneath his standard was to march with the divine promise of Rome's future. Octavian understood what Antony never fully grasped, that power was not only won on the battlefield, but secured in the minds of men. He courted senators, soothed allies, and made promises he never intended to keep. He mastered patience, willing to yield in the short term to triumph in the long. In the councils of war, Antony's voice boomed with confidence, but Octavian's quiet calculations often shaped the final decision. He was cold, even ruthless, when necessity demanded it. Enemies disappeared, rivals were outmaneuvered, and allies were discarded once their usefulness ended. He was not merely Caesar's heir, he was Caesar's refinement, sharpened and honed into a blade of pure will. Together, Antony and Octavian were a paradox. They distrusted one another, eyed each other's ambitions, and knew that one day their alliance would collapse into rivalry. Yet for now, necessity bound them. Brutus and Cassius commanded legions in the east, wealth from the provinces, and the loyalty of men who still believed in the Republic. Against such foes, neither Antony nor Octavian could prevail alone, but united they were unstoppable. The avengers of Caesar became a twin-headed beast, breathing fire and frost, devouring opposition in the name of vengeance. Their leadership reshaped the chaos of Rome into a war machine. Antony drilled the armies, forged them into instruments of destruction, and prepared them for the decisive clash. Octavian ensured the flow of resources, secured the loyalty of wavering provinces, and manipulated the Senate into sanctioning their campaign. Where Antony struck fear into the hearts of enemies, Octavian struck bargains with those who hesitated. It was a division of labor born of necessity, and it transformed disorder into discipline. The Second Triumvirate's grip on Rome was absolute. Their prescriptions bled the city of opposition, filling their coffers with confiscated wealth. Land was promised to veterans, keeping the legions loyal. Governors who wavered were replaced, those who resisted were crushed. For all their brutality, Antony and Octavian delivered what the Republic most desperately needed: direction. In a world adrift, they offered the clarity of vengeance, the certainty of war. Their enemies were named, their cause proclaimed, and their soldiers marched with purpose. Rome might bleed, but Rome would no longer drift. And so the march eastward began. Across the Adriatic, through the plains of Macedonia, the avengers of Caesar carried their legions to meet the defenders of the Republic. As their armies moved, Antony and Octavian's reputations grew into myth. To some, they were Rome's saviors, bringing order where chaos reigned. To others, they were tyrants in the making, whose alliance marked the death knell of liberty. Yet none could deny their power. They were no longer mere men. They were symbols, avatars of Caesar's lingering presence, and heralds of a new Rome, rising from the Republic's corpse. Antony, with his fiery charisma and genius for war, gave the soldiers their spirit. Octavian, with his cold precision and political mastery, gave the cause its shape. Together they forged not only an army, but an inevitability. They promised to end the chaos, to avenge Caesar, and to rebuild Rome upon the ashes of its enemies. Few doubted that Brutus and Cassius would resist with honor, but fewer still doubted that the triumvirs would prevail. For in Antony and Octavian, Rome had found not saviors of the Republic, but founders of something greater, something new. The Republic was dying, but from its death, pangs arose the outlines of an empire. And the men who led that transformation were Antony and Octavian, two leaders so different they could never coexist, yet so necessary they could not yet destroy one another. They were the leaders of rebirth, and at Philippi, they would prove whether Rome's future belonged to liberty or to empire. The plains of Philippi stretched wide beneath the Macedonian sun, a stage vast enough to hold the death throes of the Roman Republic. Dust swirled above the encamped legions, banners snapped in the autumn wind, and the air hung heavy with the knowledge that history itself would be decided here. To the east stood the armies of Brutus and Cassius, defenders of the old Republic, hardened by campaigns in the provinces. To the west advanced Antony and Octavian, the avengers of Caesar, bearing the wrath of Rome's future. Two visions of Rome faced each other across the fields, one dying, one being born. The first clash came swift and brutal. Antony, ever the master of aggressive maneuvers, drove his legions against Cassius with relentless fury. His men surged like a tide, breaking through trenches, overrunning defenses, and forcing Cassius to retreat toward the hills. Meanwhile, Brutus struck Octavian's lines with unexpected ferocity. The young heir's forces buckled, and for a moment the Republic seemed poised to triumph. Brutus's soldiers stormed Octavian's camp, seizing standards and scattering defenders. Victory and defeat danced upon the knife's edge, each side tasting both triumph and terror in a single day. Yet fate can be as cruel as it is capricious. Cassius, seeing Antony's relentless assault and mistaking a cloud of dust for Brutus's ruin, believed all was lost. Convinced that the Republic had fallen, he chose death over capture. Calling for a loyal companion, he bared his neck to the sword and met his end with stoic resolve. When Brutus learned of Cassius's fate, grief struck him like a spear. The Republic had lost one of its pillars, not in battle, but in despair. For weeks, the armies clashed again and again, their trenches soaked in blood, their fields littered with corpses. Neither side yielded, yet neither could prevail. Rome was devouring itself, its greatest sons locked in a struggle where no compromise was possible. Every soldier knew what was at stake, the very soul of the Republic. Brutus fought with the dignity of a man who believed in liberty, who dreamed of restoring Rome to its ancient virtue. Antony fought with the ferocity of a man unwilling to let Caesar's ghost go unavenged. Octavian endured, cold and calculating, watching and waiting, knowing time and numbers favored his side. At last, the final clash came. Brutus, weary yet unbroken, gathered his men for one last stand. He addressed them not with promises of riches or vengeance, but with an appeal to honor. "If Rome is to be free," he told them, "then let us prove it with our blood." With those words, he hurled his legions into battle, and for a fleeting moment, the Republic's cause blazed like a dying star. But Antony's veterans held fast. Octavian's reinforcements pressed forward, and the tide turned inexorably. One by one, the banners of the Republic fell, trampled beneath the march of Caesar's heirs. When defeat became certain, Brutus withdrew with a small band of followers to a nearby grove. There, beneath the fading light, he chose the path of honor his mentor Cato had taken years before. "O wretched virtue," he is said to have cried, "you are but a name." With that, he fell upon his sword, ending his life rather than endure the chains of tyranny. The last hope of the Republic died with him. The battlefield of Philippi fell silent, save for the groans of the wounded and the crows circling above. The Republic was no more. Its defenders lay slain or scattered, its ideals buried beneath the triumph of Caesar's avengers. Antony and Octavian stood victorious, their uneasy alliance sealed in blood. They had promised vengeance and they had delivered. Yet in so doing, they had also extinguished the last embers of liberty. For Antony, the victory was a vindication, a final consecration of his loyalty to Caesar, proof that betrayal would not go unpunished. For Octavian, it was something greater, the clearing of the path to absolute power. Though young and outwardly deferential to his elder partner, he knew in his heart that Philippi had marked the true beginning of his destiny. Rome was his to inherit, not as a republic, but as an empire waiting to be born. And so, from the carnage of Philippi, a new Rome arose. It was not the Rome of Brutus, bound to tradition and liberty, nor the Rome of Cassius, clinging to the Senate's fated authority. It was the Rome of Caesar's bloodline, a Rome forged in war, tempered in vengeance, and carried forward by ambition. The Republic was dead, and in its place stood the shadow of empire. Soon, Octavian would cast off the name of youth and take upon himself the mantle of Augustus. Soon, Rome would march not as a city of citizens, but as the heart of an empire that would endure for centuries. Philippi was not merely a battle. It was the funeral of the Republic and the christening of the empire. Amid the dust and blood of Macedonia, the world turned and Rome began anew.